A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took Mary into his home. The Gospel of the Lord. Following St. Alphonsus' deep conviction in Mary's ability to draw us closer to his son, I'd like to share with you two recent examples of how my devotion to Mary taught me to use the life that I receive from Jesus and the Eucharist in my ministry with others. Now, first, let me make a good confession. Well, a confession. Of all the works that I'm invited to do in the course of my priestly ministry, the one where I feel the most insecure, believe it or not, is that in hospital ministry. It's a ministry where one has to be prepared to face the unexpected, and it's a ministry where you meet all kinds of illnesses and pain and emotion. It's a ministry where you must be totally present to those who suffer and surrender to God so that he can use your presence as a means of bringing comfort and healing to the sick and dying. Well, years ago, there was a particular area of the hospital where I found my energy and my cheerfulness and peace would often wane, and that was in the cancer wing. And as I mentioned, 10 years ago, a problem erupted where I went to visit a dying 37-year-old man. Now, seeing his exhausted wife in the room with his two children's pictures at his bedside, at that point was just too much for me. I couldn't deal with it. So when I went home that night, again, which is often a ritual for me, while praying the rosary, I asked the Blessed Mother, "Mary, how did you handle your son's suffering and death?" And I meditated specifically on the fifth sorrowful mystery, Jesus dying on the cross. And in my imagination, I watched Mary very closely, and I saw her staying with Jesus in his suffering and opening her heart to him and allowing her heart to be pierced by a sword of sorrow, as Simeon the prophet had predicted. She couldn't stop his suffering. She couldn't fix his pain. But her silent presence was a clear indication that she was sharing in his pain. And in that sharing, she strengthened and comforted him. Suddenly, I realized that Mary was teaching me how to minister to the dying. I too should stay with them in their final sufferings. I too, like Mary, shouldn't be afraid to open my heart and allow it to also experience sadness and sorrow. And even though I can't stop their suffering and I can't fix their pain, my silent presence, I believe, helps them to bear their own sufferings. By sharing in their pain, I can give them great comfort and spiritual strength. Now, as I was praying and watching Mary very closely in my mind's eye, something strange and unexpected happened. It was like an added bonus. In my imagination that night, Mary turned away from the cross and she looked directly at me, and she assured me that just as she stayed with Jesus through his whole life, suffering and death, she would also stay at my side to strengthen and comfort me. I didn't have to be afraid of suffering and death. You see, Mary knew the real problem I was having in that cancer ward. Deep down, beyond the woman's suffering, I couldn't deal with the thought of my own suffering and death. And that 37-year-old man hit too close to home for me. For I saw myself in that dying patient and I couldn't cope, I couldn't function. But Mary knew what I needed and how to comfort and guide me. She strengthened me and was teaching me how to serve others just like she does. And it worked. For right after this little prayer experience, amazingly, I no longer had problems visiting cancer patients. Once again, what is the lesson? Mary strengthens us, comforts us, helps us in our deepest struggles. And we, in turn, are called to go and strengthen others by our presence with Jesus, who is present to us in the Blessed Sacrament.